Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to have and host, again, close friend of AIJAC and senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, Behnam Ben Taleblu. Thank you so much for coming and joining us on such a beautiful, wintry day in Melbourne. It's been 2 years since you were last here. What have your impressions been over the past 48 hours since you've been in Australia?
Joel, it's always great to be with you and great to be with AIJAC, an organization that has great reach and great impact. This reach and impact is noticed several oceans away back in the States where I live and where I work. Anytime I come to Australia, it's an affair of the head and an affair of the heart. This is a great country. It has a historic strategic relationship with the United States, and it's a marriage of strategy and values when you look at Australian foreign policy, particularly on the big picture stuff now that is uniting the West, particularly on China. But unfortunately, there's ample room for improvement on other areas of our strategic and ideological convergence, and that's issues like Iran. And one need only look at the Middle East right now, which is set ablaze on fire, where the Islamic Republic is orchestrating something of a 4, 5, 6, or even 7-front proxy war against the Jewish state. And I really hate to say it, but I told you so. The last time I was here, I had the pleasure of being here via AIJAC in August 2022. And I said that there is now time to scale up our activities together to build a multilateral pressure policy against the Islamic Republic to handicap this architecture of terror that they've created. And they actually called themselves the axis of resistance, this constellation of downtrodden and dispossessed persons and terrorist groups and militias across the region that the Islamic Republic has put state-level capabilities into their hands. I remember in 2018, Iran's chief terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, someone who the Trump administration killed via drone strike in Iraq in January 2020. Back in 2018, this individual said that the Red Sea could be turned ablaze. The Red Sea between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the bottom of which Yemen is located. When I translated this statement and started talking about the potential maritime threat of the Houthis, which are the rebel group that Tehran backs politically and militarily in Yemen, I was basically laughed at in Washington. I was also laughed at in 2019 and 2022 in Australia and through an official and unofficial capacity by worrying about this. But the Islamic Republic has put state-level capabilities into the hands of the Houthis. They didn't create the Houthis like they helped create Hezbollah or some of these Shia militias in Iraq. But the Houthis have now game-changing weapons. They have medium-range ballistic missiles. European countries don't have these capabilities. They have anti-ship ballistic missiles. They're the only proxy of the Islamic Republic with anti-ship ballistic missiles. And we are far behind the cost curve, we, the West, in terms of a larger multilateral coalition that can impose costs on these proxies, let alone on the patrons. So zooming out 2 years ago, unfortunately, I have to say, many of the threats that we've faced, we, the collective West, have grown in intensity. The Islamic Republic has noticed this kind of reticence and hesitance and restraint that we have, and they've actually played on that and used it to their advantage. And even the fact that it's taken so long to get some sanctions off the ground in Australia, commendable work. Sanctions off the ground in Canada, sanctions off the ground in the EU and in the UK, and US policy is a whole separate ordeal. But they've noticed that, and they've taken advantage of that time. And now Iranian drones can be found on 4 different continents. Now, I remember back in 2020, for example, the Europeans were laughing at attempts to multilateralize an arms embargo that was lapsing. Now European citizens and critical infrastructure is being targeted by a widening radius of Iranian drones and soon to be ballistic missiles. So the threats to the Middle East, as you know, don't stay limited to the Middle East. And they're right now in the real world, 10, 11 months after October 7, they're intensifying in that heartland. So
how did we get here? So the point is that last time you were here 2 years ago, you were speaking of this shadow war. There was clear indications that Israel and Iran were engaged in more than was just back and forward rhetoric. The region was on the precipice of something large, and then obviously we had the events of October 7, where there have been considerable accusations of Iranian involvement and assistance to Hamas in carrying out the attack. So the question is that why the quick, how we've progressed from 2 years to now. The region is ablaze. The proxies are emboldened. Iran is now, not only threatening to attack, but has attacked Israel directly, and not just exclusively through its proxies, but also through its proxies. So how did we get here? What in your assessment was, you predicted the events, but how did the events actually begin to occur?
You know, there's three big P words. Some people like to focus on politics, other people like to focus on policy, but the big picture issue, I hate to say it, is philosophical. And it's not designed to bore you, but it's designed to say how we think of the problem handicaps or circumscribes the tools that we have to address that problem. And unfortunately, in 2021 and into 2022, up until we got to October 7 in 2023, much of the West, and in particular America's policy towards the Islamic Republic, was designed to turn a blind eye to some of these regional threats, over-focus on the nuclear issue, and politically work to resurrect the policy of some kind of limited pause nuclear deal that the West, and particularly America, was interested in. And in particular, this JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is a bit of a political dogma in at least one flank of the American body politic, in the Democratic Party and their supporters. And it's kind of like a religion. And unfortunately, many of these things were sacrificed on the altar of that religion: a good regional policy, a good maritime policy. It even led to the US being caught with its pants down when massive nationwide protests hit over 150 different cities, towns, and villages in September 2022 under the Zan Zendegi Azadi, or the Women Life Freedom Movement. And that went on for nearly a year. And the most that we had was sanctions. I think it's really a time for the West to revisit some of these philosophical assumptions that you can pay to delay or pay to play with the Islamic Republic. And the longer we actually delay the conversation about what kind of a solution we need to this problem.
So the regime saw its opportunity and took it. They saw weakness. They saw that the pursuit of a renewed JCPOA was exactly where the West wanted for things to go, and they essentially took advantage of that and have done what they've done over the past 2 years since you were last here.
They've pocketed concessions and they've played hardball in the region.
And their involvement in October 7, in your assessment?
There's two different strands of reporting. There's a Reuters strand of reporting that says the regime was shocked. There's a Wall Street Journal strand of reporting that says the regime was closely coordinating some of this proxy activity and helping Hamas train for this kind of stuff. I think you don't even need to look at either strand. This is not about whose journalism is better. This is about how the Islamic Republic architects its terrorism in the region and really globally. It finds people that it knows want to shoot at the same people that they want to shoot at, but it materially supports their quest to shoot at them. And this is a big picture strategic reason that the Islamic Republic has, and a much more localized grievance that it can capitalize on. And for Hamas, the terrorist group that carried out the October 7 terror attack, they were basically atoning for the last war, the 11-day war in May. They still, these guys mean what they say when they say death to Israel. These guys mean what they say about when you look at what's in their charter. And you saw what they did. They acted on their principles on October 7. It looked like what all the kibbutzim looked like. No fat on that. For the Islamic Republic, they were looking to basically set the Arab world, and in particular the Arab street, ablaze and against the Arab states. They saw an entirely different geopolitical architecture emerging with the Abraham Accords, the tightening of Israel in the region, and something that may have been in the shadows in the 2010s was coming out of the shadows. And it was this newfound relationship between the moderate Arab bloc and Israel. And for so long, the Palestinian issue was basically a veto on these two sides coming together. The Trump administration got around that veto. They also critically moved Israel into CENTCOM, the military organization that coordinates for that region. And the slow, steady work of a lot of that coordination, some of that boring bureaucratic stuff, has led to so many high-level successes. Israeli participation in some war games, more U.S. interoperability with Israelis and the Americans, but Israelis and the Arabs, but also getting the same kind of shared threat assessment, the same shared picture of these Iranian missiles and drones. And that led to the successes we had on April 13, April 14, basically intercepting 90+% of what the regime has fired. But to go back, the regime saw this coming and was looking to basically stop the crown jewel from being moved into this equation, which is Saudi Arabia. Lest we forget the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. He had a line late in the 1980s where he said, if you forget about Saddam, if you forget about the Palestinian question, if you forget about America, we will never forgive the Al Saud. So this ideational enmity is deeply baked into the Islamic Republic. And they didn't want the Israelis to be able to move closer there because they saw this as encroachment on basically their territory. And you've even seen this in the speeches of Khamenei. Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, his last, I think, public speech before October 7, I think, was October 3rd. And he basically likened those who are warming ties with the Israelis to betting on a losing horse. Again, this is an individual who means what he says. And many months after, during the boom and bust cycle of violence that we saw from Gaza, there was another speech by Khamenei saying those Arab governments that are still trying to normalize with the Israelis should fear their own people. So long story short, the Islamic Republic took a local actor with a localized grievance who was trying to atone for one of their previous defeats and who had every intention of acting on their ideology, put more guns, put more training in their hands, but then stepped back from the equation and let them take advantage of it. This is why this operation, in my view, from an intelligence perspective, was so hard to detect. The Islamic Republic is not always micromanaging its proxies. It has this big picture, ideological and strategic vision of what it wants to accomplish, but then it moves others into the fore towards achieving that end.
Does that micromanagement of its proxies extend to Hezbollah? Because, as you know, Hezbollah didn't enter the conflict until the next day, until October the 8th.
Well, that was quite early, actually.
Well, it was early, but it wasn't to the full veracity of the units and the materials that they had at their disposal. It was quite low level. There wasn't a huge ground incursion that came from the north. Were you surprised with what Hezbollah did on October the 8th in response to what Hamas did in the south?
Not really, because Hezbollah has scaled up. I mean, what Hezbollah is doing now with Israel, make no mistake, they're not just fighting the IDF, they're not just targeting civilians. Again, to philosophy, they are targeting Zionism. There are 40 plus towns and villages in northern Israel that are depopulated. There's 60 to 80,000 people internally displaced. The way this is being spun in the Lebanese media, and particularly in the Iranian media, when they see that kids can't go back to school, they are saying that they have moved Israel back. You know, so much of Israel's post-2006 situation, you can call it, with Hezbollah, has been to move Hezbollah back from the Litani, has been to try to get the Americans, the French, the Lebanese armed forces, the UN Security Council to enforce Resolution 1701, to demilitarize that zone. But not only is it not demilitarized, not only is Hezbollah occupying that space, they are now moving the Israelis further south in their own country. So this is a very dangerous situation that is going on in Israel's north.
I think that's a critical point, because Israel is shrinking essentially, and I've spent a lot of time in hotels in Israel since October 7. There is a number of displaced people from the north that still have no prospect of returning back to their homes, and it's a devastating narrative that I don't think is getting enough attention internationally. Certainly not here in Australia, of the fact that you have tens of thousands of displaced people with no prospect of going back home at all, and it's not due to the conflict in the south; it's due to the conflict in the north.
Exactly.
But okay, a very meaty question, which you can take your time to answer. But we've had October 7 happen. We have the war in Gaza. We have April 14th. A very large but direct attack by the Iranians on the Israelis through a range of attack drones, cruise and ballistic missiles that, as you say, the majority of the projectiles were intercepted through a multinational and force that was able to come together and assist with that. So over the next couple of months, and I guess let's have a look periodically from now until maybe November, which obviously we're using the presidential election in the United States as that anchor. But what do you...
No big deal.
Yeah, exactly.
No big
of course
deal.
not. But what do you see happen? So again, come at it as, what do you see? We've got the Haniya hit as well. Are we looking at what's your prediction of what Iran will do in terms of what it's done before as a precedent, and the response to whether or not it was embarrassed by the fact that the majority of the projectiles from April the 14th were intercepted successfully? Does it do something different? Does it increase? Does it decrease? How does it use its proxies? Not just Hezbollah, but its other proxies in the region. Does it increase its destabilizing force inside Jordan? Does it send through what they have inside southern Syria? So what do you see from the Iranian side of the ledger as to what they're going to do between now and November to test things out, or to provide their responses they so clearly state that they will do? And then what do you see the response from not just Israel, but its international partners such as the United States, such as the European Union, doing in response to what you think Iran will do?
Well, there's a lot, but let me add one to that if it's okay, and that's the nuclear issue. In June and July, it was reported, just a small, no big deal, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism trying to get the most lethal and destabilizing weapons, but no big deal.
Yeah, so how does that play into it? So you know,
I am very worried about this issue. Let's work our way through part of the summer. You've had essentially monitoring and verification missions awry. You've had finally the U.S. summoning the political courage after 18 months this summer to work with its European partners who are to the right of America on the nuclear issue. This is critical. America's diplomatic partners who used to love diplomacy with the Islamic Republic, they are to the right of the Biden administration on the nuclear issue. This is a big deal. This is how far America has fallen with respect to trying to counter these threats. They summoned the courage to put this thing called a resolution of censure. That's basically diplomatic finger-wagging at the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors. This was followed by the Islamic Republic, reportedly exposed by Axios, engaging in computer modeling of what we don't know, but of, we believe, likely weaponization-related activities, and also metallurgy. These are some of the final components you need for a nuclear weapon. They have a delivery vehicle, they have the fissile material. There's still a lot of unknown unknowns as to how far they have gotten on weaponization. And this is a much harder intelligence target. It can happen much smaller. You don't need a gigantic facility. This can be on someone's laptop, on a USB key. There's a lot of modeling that needs to go on. So the fact that this modeling was reported, and then the US allegedly sent a private message to the Islamic Republic, basically saying to get them to knock it off, that's called deterrence by detection. We've detected something that you're doing, and we try to stop you from continuing down that path, otherwise we'll expose it. This gets to the Islamic Republic's larger plan, which is that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. They can orchestrate a multi-front war against Israel and advance their weapons program.
But do you think that they will advance the weapons program?
They have advanced the program.
And they will utilize that and leverage off that for whatever gains they want to make?
It makes presenting a tougher economic policy, a tougher military policy, a tougher intelligence policy, that much harder against the Islamic Republic because of how much more advanced they'll be. They're trying to create a nuclear fait accompli. Let's not forget, there was deterrence by detection in 2002 when we detected these guys are building enrichment facilities and they have a heavy water reactor. This entire civilian veneer, this entire 2-decade-long diplomatic quest is brought to you by that last deterrence by detection. This more recent kind of deterrence by detection is that final element on the Sunday. We want to stop that. And so my great concern is, as we focus rightly on the region, we should not lose focus of the technical gains the regime is creating and their policy of dangling the last few steps to get us to not put pressure on them. This is why, exactly, when you tie it back to April, between April 13, 14, and when the regime struck Israel, and April 19, when Israel responded, you had an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps official come out onto TV of a unit that no one ever knew existed, the Nuclear Security and Protection Forces, basically outing himself, saying, yeah, if necessary and the context requires, we will change the nuclear doctrine. So those who took solace in some kind of nuclear fatwa or religious prohibition, that stuff can essentially be done with overtaken with the stroke of a pen. And so the regime is running to the edge of a cliff.
How soon? They stroke of a pen, and then how soon until they're ready to test?
It could be 6 months is, in my view, a minimum timeline. That's what some
Minimum 6 months.
Yeah, that's what some experts have been saying.
But you think that is now getting shorter because they have
they're creeping along,
energized their program, as you suggest, and you think that is grouped into their overall strategy
in the region. That's right. There's two big things in the region besides the proxy war, which is, one is that they're actually counting on America to restrain Israel. And the second is they're increasingly getting bolder about talking about changing their nuclear strategy. You know, back in February of this year, you had the former head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency say, yeah, it's basically like building a car. We have all the components. We just haven't dropped the engine in. I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said it's all there. You have to assemble it. And this should be setting off major alarm bells. These are claims the Islamic Republic is able to make about its atomic infrastructure because of how advanced it is, and because of some of the failures in Western policy in trying to stop these advances. So the way Iran is able to fight its proxy war is to, one, count on American restraint, and two, dangle more nuclear escalation to drive more American restraint, because that desire for restraint is not going to be put towards the adversary, the Islamic Republic. It's going to be put towards Israel.
So you think that they'll be able to turn up the heat, the Iranians will be able to turn up the heat regionally, whilst at the same time using the dangling of their nuclear proliferation, that they'll be able to get the Americans to put more pressure on the Israelis to restrain themselves through either a retaliatory reaction to whatever the Iranians do, or even proactive activities in the region as well.
Exactly. It's to get Israel to back down. They'll change the causal arrows to say Israel will drive the crisis. Therefore, tell your friend to back down.
And you think that the current administration is doing that?
I fear that the Islamic Republic is rightly counting on that sentiment in the Biden administration. Yes.
Right. So before we move on to looking more domestically at the United States, for as we've jokingly pointed out, you do have an election coming up in November. So just again, over the next couple of months, from a practical military or non-military or what have you, what do you suspect will occur? Will Iran and or its proxies directly hit Israel as they have not done, into the veracity, into the volume that they have not done thus far?
I think the April 13, 14 interceptions are historic, but they are dwarfed, in my view, by the fact that the Islamic Republic felt comfortable enough to launch these projectiles. Yes, they telegraphed that strike. Yes, they hit the gas and the brakes at the same time. Yes, they fired older systems. Yes, they fired some low and slow-flying systems that they knew would be intercepted. But also, yes, they wanted to kill. Yes, they wanted to wash away blood with blood. And in this sense, they want to get all of the status dividends of being seen as moving from the shadows to contest Israel. Make no mistake, this is a shadow warfighter. When they move from the shadows out into the open, there is something driving that. Part of it is the confidence in the arsenal. Part of it is the confidence of how they read the region. Part of it is the confidence of how they read the drama in the U.S.-Israel relationship and in the West-Israel relationship. And yes, it was a major win for Western and Israeli military technology, this architecture of deterrence by denial to intercept this large volume of projectiles. But in my view, that hasn't stopped the Islamic Republic. The Israelis couldn't even claim, allegedly, because the Biden administration said to take the win. They couldn't even claim the more limited but impactful attack they had on an Iranian radar facility in a town called Esfahan back on April 19th. And the fact that the Islamic Republic could claim its barrage and the Israelis couldn't claim their attack should be setting off alarm bells, because military conflicts are not just defined by military tools, they're defined by the political optics. And
those political optics are critically important region.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
One of the predicates of moderate Arab Israeli rapprochement is for having a strong Israel. An influential Israel, and
the fact that actually, don't take it from me, take it from a former Iranian president who was a military commander in the Iran-Iraq War. This is basically Iran's World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War rolled all up into one. They call it Difai Muqaddas, or the Holy Defense. Everybody who's anybody in Iran today cut their teeth in that war. And in 2002, this former president, his name is Rafsanjani, essentially called Israel a one-bomb state. Now, yes, April 13, April 14 was a massive win for the military technology of Israel and the West and this integrated air and missile defense infrastructure. But make no mistake, depending on the video you look at, 4 to 7 warheads landed on Israeli territory, hit a plane, a runway, and a base. That is 4 to 7 too many. If even one of those 4 to 7 warheads was nuclear, we would be in a game over situation. And this potential fear is what the Islamic Republic can rightly dangle. And it's why they are still not deterred yet. Yes, there's more U.S. military forces in the region this August after the killing of Haniya. Yes, the Islamic Republic now learned, okay, I launched 100 ballistic missiles in April, 50 of them failed, the vast majority of them were intercepted, so maybe I need to launch 200 the next time. Yes, they learned about how the West has layered its air and missile defenses. Yes, they learned where their interceptors were versus where there are jets. They learned the strengths and the weaknesses of Arrow and David Sling and Iron Dome. But they are not deterred, and that's the problem. The adversary really feels that all they might expend or lose is the cost of the projectile they fire. And until they know that they have more to lose, we will always again be on hair's edge in the region, or on razor's edge in the region, which is why I think we're still, basically waiting for the Islamic Republic to respond to the killing of Haniya.
But you think they will respond?
I think now there's based on more recent media reports about the U.S. trying to force a ceasefire through the Doha Channel, there is the Islamic Republic doing something and the axis of resistance doing something in the region that I also fear, which is looking at the way the Israelis have fought wars in the region, looking at the way the Americans have fought wars in the region. Those two countries are conventionally superior, super strong intelligence apparatus, and they use military means to achieve military ends. The Islamic Republic and its terrorist axis use military means to achieve political ends. And so what I'm afraid of now is in a world where they may not strike Israel, what they may do is, again, dangle that threat and then use that threat to get the White House to pull the plug on the Gaza war, face saving line of retreat that also involves some kind of hostage deal. And what the Islamic Republic has been trying to do since October 7, which is to fight this multi-front war against Israel, begin to test out how integrated its axis of resistance can be. Oh, and by the way, the most critical, which is to make sure that Hamas is not militarily wiped off from the battlefield, because what they don't want to vindicate is the idea that you can use military force against its proxies. And if they somehow manage to bail out Sinwar hiding in some tunnel, in some human shield situation, probably guarded by the hostages that he still has, somewhere deep in Gaza, if you devalue that, then you'll devalue the use of force against Hezbollah. You'll devalue the use of force against the Houthis. And this terrorist regime will fight to live another day.
So let's move to the United States. The election coming up in November. What does 4 years of Kamala Harris presidency look like, and what does 4 years of a Trump presidency look like in the context to Iran?
I mean this with immense respect. I'm saying this in a personal capacity about what I project a potential Harris administration could have, is that she might mean all things to all people. In a sense, she might amplify some of the progressive left talking points on distance in the U.S.-Israel relationship. The more distance there is, I think, by the way, the more you have more conflict and instability in the region, not less, because that distance between America and Israel actually emboldens Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic, what have you. It leads to more conflict in the region, not less, because they'll sense gaps and opportunities. But nonetheless, to kind of support that base, she might act on some of the statements that she's made in the past. There's this whole kind of Kremlinology, navel-gazing about the people that are currently serving with her versus those who have served in her presidential campaign back pre-2020. Phil Gordon is someone who is interested in, with respect, at best, transacting with the region, not trying to transform the region. So he may not, or they may not, connect the dots between Hezbollah and Tehran. They may not connect the dots between the nuclear issue and the regional issue.
Is that a legacy of the 2 terms of the Obama administration?
It's that plus the hangover of the Iraq War on all sides of the American political spectrum. Right. The botched nature of that war, the fact that the American body politic isn't able to point to wins in Afghanistan or in Iraq also drives that sentiment. But also, where there may be issues where she doesn't have a clear agenda, perhaps some of the other more centrist or mainstream elements of the Democratic Party may try to graft, either through personnel as policy or through statements and talking points, may try to graft a worldview onto her. It's just that I haven't heard her say much about the region critically during this critical time.
Right, so you see a continuation of current 3.5 years of
with some potential to get worse.
Right, and 4 years of Trump?
I think the Republican Party would look to this region basically saying it's a mess, but have a better sense of the ordering of the principle of the things that matter. They may still also eerily be in the transactional, not transformational business, and they may be looking for wins on the cheap. But I think they may lock down some critical components. You need to pressure the Islamic Republic. You need to build bridges between Saudi and Israel. You need to make sure you have Israel's back. These could be the building blocks of a better regional order. And I hope that both sides of the American spectrum, the left and the right, sense that the major issues where there is convergence on, China, for example, stopping foreign election interference, stopping the kind of authoritarian axis of autocrats, Putin, Xi, the Kim family, Khamenei, stopping these guys. I hope that we can all connect the dots and realize that how we have our debates with each other in these liberal democracies in the West matters. And we can't let them take advantage of how we have these fights.
And what's Iran's response to both? So what's the Iranian response to a Harris presidency, and what's the Iran's response?
Before we even get there, it's important to note that U.S. intelligence agencies are saying that
they're involved in
election interference, but also that they critically don't want a Trump 2.0. Right. They understand that
why?
even...
So explain why.
Because the Trump administration broke several sacred cows on the Iran policy fight. One is, of course, that many in Washington, but many in the West, believe that when the Iranian people are on the street, you can't come out and support them. Critically, this handicapped the Obama administration's Iran policy in 2009 in the Green Movement. The Trump administration did away with that and really proved that actually you can stand morally and politically and philosophically with protesting Iranians, and that you can have tough sanctions on the regime at the same time. So one, he slaughtered this sacred cow of you can issue strong rhetorical support for the Iranian population, which is protesting. And the second is the strength of US unilateral sanctions. The Trump administration, despite all odds, despite all of its allies, and unfortunately Australia was in there as well, major transatlantic partners like the UK and the EU were in there as well, opposed the use of these unilateral sanctions. But in 1.5 years' time, macroeconomically, the Trump administration did more macroeconomic damage to Tehran than a decade plus of multilateral sanctions. And again, you don't have to take it from me. 3 or 4 times from 2019 to 2020, once by Iran's former president, and then 2 or 3 times by their oil minister at the time, they said that the value and the shock and the pain of just the Trump-era oil sanctions alone was greater than the aggregate pain of the Iran-Iraq war. Right. Anywhere else in the world, if you have an economic policy that can cause more damage without firing a bullet than a war that this regime fought for 8 years to a bloody standstill, that would be applauded. And for some reason, that wasn't applauded in Washington or among our friends in the West. But Tehran understands that this could easily come back.
Right, but my assumption is that the Trump administration would be aware of that as well. So
and would want to bring it back.
Would want to bring it back as well.
Yes.
So let's tie it up, but bring it to arguably the most important question or questions, and that's domestically about Australia's policy towards Iran. So we have a government now who's in over 2 years of its term. Traditionally, we have an interesting bilateral relationship with the Iranians that is not necessarily, from one side of politics to the other, hasn't necessarily been great. But Australia is acutely aware of state-based nefarious activity in Australia through, foreign interference, cyber hacking, or direct spying on Australians, setting up shop at universities and whatnot. Australia currently does not list the IRGC as a listed terror organization in Australia. Do you think that we should? And if so, why?
I think all of the Five Eyes countries that share intelligence with one another need to see 2020 in this decade of the 2020s on all of these national security threats. It's great, I think, what Australia has done vis-a-vis the prescription of Hezbollah back in the day. And I know AIJAC commented quite critically and played a quite critical role in the public debate about the need to prescribe Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. Now that has to be scaled up to the patron of Hezbollah. You can't just go after the proxy and ignore the patron. It would make little strategic sense. It would make little ideological sense. And I think also to see this tool, this prescription tool, not just as a national security tool, but as a legal tool to support the safety and the security of Australian citizens, and to make sure the Islamic Republic of Iran is not permitted that long arm through embassies and cultural centers and universities and everything else that you just mentioned that traditionally gives it an inroads into a more liberal, often democratic society where they can engage in things like lone wolf radicalization. And instead, Australia should be taking a page from some of what the other folks are doing. Canada has designated the IRGC in its entirety after a decade-plus long, rancorous, arduous national debate. And if the Canadians can do it, I certainly think the Australians can too.
So you touched on some real tangible outcomes of a listing as to how it can actually, protect the lives of citizens. So just in the Canadian context, can you just give a few examples as to what the listing does and how it actually has a positive impact on the lives of Canadian citizens?
Ironically, and among friends, I know we're recording this, but what you'll hear from folks who don't want to engage in the listing is that it doesn't do much anyway. It has symbolic value. But then I would ask all of these countries that have these legal regimes, these terrorist listings, then why do you have these terrorist listings and legal regimes to begin with? Is it merely symbolism? And even if it is merely symbolism, why doesn't going after and calling a spade, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, why does it not apply here, but it might apply in other areas? And why can't we get more congruity between this sanctions regime and other ones. Australia deserves immense credit for the historic, back I think it was in December 2022, the first historic Magnitsky sanctions timed with the US and I think with New Zealand as well, standing up for the Iranian people in practice and in principle using these Magnitsky authorities. These are things you have to scale up. Australia has gone after some elements of the Iran-Russia drone trade. It would make little sense to not use the other elements of your sanctions regimes when you've sunk these costs on Iran-Russia drone, when you've sunk them on human rights, but you won't sink them on terrorism and to protect your own citizenry. So there is great incongruity there. So it's in their own political interest to beef this up and make sure there is a level playing field.
Yeah,
and for the Canadian context, just to go a little bit further, it's to make sure that you have on the domestic front these tools as legal tools to use. You know, this is the strength of these democracies, to be able to use the system of law to defend yourself, lest we have to move to kinetic means.
So there is a legal argument that there's a legislative impediment in Australia that does not allow the listing of a state-based instrument like the definition, or like the IRGC is defined by the government, that it can't list it as it's a state-based actor. What is your message to an argument like that?
You know, I just say this as a friend of Australia, as an American citizen. Wherever there are legal problems, there are legal solutions. So that's one. And the second is actually to take a page now from the Europeans. The Europeans also, through different boom and bust cycles of how they feel about Iran, some days they're more hawkish, some days they're less hawkish. Some days they connect the dots between terrorism and sometimes they don't. I think it was back in 2019, they sanctioned, despite still not having sanctioned the IRGC in its entirety, they sanctioned an element of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security. So they were able to take a piecemeal approach. And while I disagree with this kind of kaleidoscopic piecemeal approach, that is much better than nothing. So perhaps even taking a page from them and maybe amending some of these rules to say, well, you need not go after organizations or institutions belonging to every sovereign state. But if you're worried about terrorism, one potential carve-out could be you have the right to target elements of state sponsors of terrorism under your counter-terrorist authorities. That would make immense sense, and you would narrowly scope it to those countries that are state sponsors of terrorism and use either their foreign ministries or their intelligence ministries or their militaries, as in the case of the Islamic Republic, to promote this kind of terrorism and hate speech and violence and instability.
So importantly, in the IRGC example, because it doesn't work for the others, it certainly doesn't work for Hezbollah and it doesn't work for Hamas. But in the IRGC's example, you're suggesting that if you can't get the whole lot listed, which it would be your number one most favorable outcome, if you can't list the whole lot, there will be some impact to the organization if you do it bit by bit, unit by unit.
You can, but it's also worth noting that you may have other authorities as well. So my strong recommendation is under counterterrorism authorities to go after the entirety of the apparatus. But then you may want to, under counter-proliferation authorities, go after the aerospace force. You may want to go after, if you want to test the waters on how good the whole authorities are, to go after the entire IRGC under human rights authorities. You can, these are very creative legal and political options, again, available to Western liberal democracies to use to test these waters as their relationship with Iran changes over time.
Final question. So you're here in Oceania for a week and a half. What did you, when you were flying here, you didn't know what was going to happen, whether or not something was going to happen mid-flight or whatnot regionally. But what's your message? What do you want to get across to the people that you're going to meet while you're here?
You know, even as our trip begins now, I see the willingness of Australian citizens and Australian officials and Australian media in getting good on the rising China challenge. I would just strongly tell everyone here in Australia that we can't disconnect the dots between those who keep the Islamic Republic in power, which are essentially Russia and China. The Islamic Republic is this critical link between a whole host of violent non-state actors and a whole host of those great power competitors of Australia and of America and of the liberal democratic order. So my strong recommendation to them is to connect the dots, not just between patron and proxy, but between mid-level threats and great power threats, So Australia, in my view, philosophically, ideologically, cannot get good on the China challenge without getting good on the Iran challenge. There's no quarantining of this new global Cold War that we are now in.
So can you, again, I did say it was going to be the final question, but you raised the big issue of China, which is obviously essential to us here. Just for the audience's sake, the relationship between Iran and China has grown quite a lot over the past couple of years. How does that play out both globally and regionally for us here in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, it's something you have to keep in mind. It's since 2011 at least, China has been the largest licit and illicit importer of Iranian oil. And I think Australians, as they get good on the China challenge, cannot ignore the rising implications of China keeping the Islamic Republic in business. There is, again, the great connective tissue there. So my strong recommendation is to look at where those connections are, look at the military flows, the economic flows, the fact that there are trilateral naval exercises often, I think near the Indian Ocean, usually with Russia, China, Iran, to not ignore the potential for some of this digital repression technology to move from Beijing to Tehran. There's already been good reporting back in 2022 and 2023 about the implications of, I think, 10 Chinese tech companies that are either on the Tehran Stock Exchange or have subsidiaries or affiliates in Tehran that do things like facial recognition and censorship. So there's a strong moral case to connect the dots. There's a strong political case to connect the dots. And again, just on the surface level view I have of how Australia is changing on the China challenge, and this is with great distance, both what I've seen in my first few days here and also what I can see from back in Washington, you can't have one without the other.
Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.